The last thing Lacey needed was a blind date on Valentine's Day. She had zero desire to meet the man her mother had set her up with, but she owed the woman who'd birthed her for having vetoed the last blind date attempt. It had broken her mother's heart that her one and only child refused to go on a blind date with a pastor from church. It didn't matter that he'd looked like a hobbit with hairy knuckles or that his eyebrows touched in the middle. He was a pastor, and Mom's images of a religious figure as her son-in-law had been shattered when Lacey said no. She'd been assured that tonight's blind date was drop dead handsome. Sinful, her mother had said, a giggle following. Where had she met this sinful delight? Why, at the butcher shop. He'd been picking up an order for his own mother, which made him even more appealing. A man who loves his mama, her mother had said. What a catch. Sure, a man who quite possibly had an overbearing mother who still required that a man in his late 30s pick up packages of meat for her at the butcher shop. A man who'd sit there talking to a middle-aged woman who looked and acted quite a bit like Rachel Ray, big, boisterous voice and high energy, about his job, his mother, and his life. While her mom had a habit of drawing strangers to her, Lacey felt embarrassed in advance for the questions that appeared her mother had asked him. So far, she'd exchanged texts with him and had one phone call. His deep voice vibrated across the cellular waves and made her think of Tony Todd. It was the only thing that had her looking forward to meeting him. If his appearance matched his voice, he was exactly as sinful as her mother had said. She'd asked her mother not to give her too much information from the woman's insane digging. In fact, she'd stopped every sentence that started to come out. Any information Lacey had, which wasn't much, had come from him via text. He worked as some sort of consultant, lived in an apartment above a downtown shop where he could hear the music from a strip of dance clubs every night and liked to hike in the mountains on weekends. As far as Lacey could remember, she told him she worked as a bookkeeper at a small restaurant, lived in a townhouse in an expensive part of town, and also liked to hike, even though she hadn't really done it in at least a year. It had felt good to have something in common with him, though, even with it being a date under protest. There's no reason he needed to know that. What a poor way to start a date that would be. He'd asked her to meet him at a ritzy modern place downtown that sold small plates and tapas. She could already feel how hungry she'd be later, but it was admittedly a restaurant she'd driven by multiple times and been curious about. At least there'd be wine to accompany the single cracker with an olive and a smear of cheese. Oh, and something green. There was always something green. They were meeting in 1 hour, and here she stood in front of her closet with a pile of refused clothing scattered on the floor in her bed. Nothing looked good. Was it possible she was nervous about the date? It had been a long time since she'd cared enough about a date to feel nervous. Suck it up and pick something, she told herself. The next outfit she tried on was good enough that she decided it had to be the one. Not too slutty, not too prudish. It struck the perfect balance, and it made her ass look amazing, all without being so skimpy she'd freeze to death in the Colorado winter. While the city had lucked out weather-wise with clear skies and a moderate temperature in the 50s during the day, the temperature would drop significantly once the sun ducked down behind the mountains. No way did she want to be cold all night, especially when dinner downtown would mean finding a parking spot and walking an absurd distance. Lacey put on her makeup, slipped into a cute pair of boots that had enough traction to hopefully keep her from falling on her ass on the patches of ice that would likely spot the sidewalks downtown, and went out to her car. It was slightly later than she'd intended to leave, but she could still make it. Of course, after circling about 1 billion times, she finally had to settle for a parking spot a good mile away from the restaurant. It seemed everyone else in the city had come downtown for V-Day too. She took a second to send a text to Vincent that she was running late and had parked several blocks away. No worries, he texted back. I got us a table. Relieved that she'd be able to sit down when she got there, Lacey nuzzled down into her coat and walked into the wind, which tore at her cheeks and made her ears sore. There weren't too many patches of ice, mostly just the opening of alleyways where the sun hadn't been able to shine, and the walk wasn't as unpleasant as she'd feared. She'd parked far enough away that there was no other foot traffic here, though she could see the lights of the restaurants not too far ahead of her. Here in this mostly residential area, warm light spilled from a couple houses onto hibernating lawns, but there were no street lights until the end of the houses up ahead. It felt quiet on this part of the street, even with the bustling energy not too far away. The houses were primarily Victorian, some of them converted into apartments or dorm rooms for Colorado College, which took up a couple city blocks. It seemed strange that there weren't more students out in the grounds where they typically gathered, no matter the weather. The library and art center were lit up, but the other buildings were dark. Lacey breathed a sigh of relief when she reached the first of the streetlights. One more block and she'd be in the company of other people. Just one couple nearby would make her feel exponentially better. The wind blew dried leaves and trash around, making it so the scrabbling of items across the pavement was loud enough to cover up the sound of her own footsteps. She glanced around, feeling the tingle of being watched, but didn't see anyone nearby. Speeding up her pace, Lacey jogged past an alley between two squat concrete buildings. A figure moved out of the shadows just as she reached the corner of the second building. She felt more than saw him fall into step behind her. One more block and she'd reached the first restaurant. Couples milled about in front of it. They were in sight, which meant she was also within their sight. It wouldn't make sense for someone to attack her this close to other people. The man's footsteps matched hers at first, but now they sped up. Lacey did the same, finally breaking into a run. She just needed to get past the next alley and she'd be in the busier section of downtown. He'd gotten so close she could hear him breathing. Voices drifted to her from those waiting outside restaurants. The night grew brighter with more lights nearby. Then the footsteps behind her drifted away. Lacey turned to check and sure enough, the man was gone. She'd freaked out over nothing. Her phone chimed and she checked it. A text from Vincent. Want me to order you a drink? She paused and moved over against the wall of the nearest building to text him back. Almost there. Yes, you can get me a glass of Chardonnay, please? You got it. Smiling, she slipped the phone back into her coat pocket and stepped away from the wall. As she approached the alley, a set of headlights shone from within it, so she paused to let whoever it was pull out onto the street. A large blue panel van pulled out. The driver, a woman with light hair, pulled back into a ponytail. She turned on the left turn blinker but didn't pull out, even though there was no traffic. The woman turned her head and looked at Lacey, her face stiff and unreadable. Her hands were on the wheel, clenched tight. Then the big door on the side was opening, and footsteps were running up behind Lacey. She turned to look behind her, but was too slow. Someone large collided with her. He wrapped his arms around her body and put a hand across her face. It covered her mouth, nose, and eyes. Lacey got glimpses of the night through the leather-gloved fingers, snapshots of the van, faces within, the street, the alley. She landed on the floor of the van, the air knocked out of her. Eyes now uncovered, Lacey tried to look around, but a man pulled his sack over her head and snugged it at her neck. Voices whispered around her. She strained to hear what they said, but could only make out snippets. One voice overrode the others. Go, go, go! The van squealed out of the alley. Lacey got thrown against the back of the seats in front of her. Hands pulled her roughly back. The sack was hot, itchy, stifling. She struggled to slow her breathing. It felt like she was suffocating. Someone grabbed her arm and pressed her wrists together. A firm, sticky substance wrapped around her wrists. Tape. Her ankles were next. She kicked out against them, but with two separate sets of hands holding her, they got her ankles taped up, no problem. Thoughts swirled through her head. Where were they taking her? Who were they? Why her? And the big question, what were they planning on doing with her? At least she'd been meeting someone. He'd know she was missing. He had her mother's phone number and she his. They would call the police. They'd be looking for her. Her knowledge of true crime told her she would likely die in the first 48 hours, if that's what these people were after. There was also talk of human trafficking in Colorado. If they shipped her elsewhere, sold her to someone, she'd find a way out. They couldn't keep her a prisoner. It bothered her that she hadn't been smarter, hadn't parked closer, hadn't fought harder, or at all. It had taken her so long to register what was even happening. The van had blocked view of what was happening to her from the diners ahead of her, but maybe someone had been behind her or across the street. Maybe someone had lived in the apartments over the bank she'd noticed, and they'd looked out at just the right time. Surely they would have been able to make out the license plate and call it in. The van slowed, turned left, and accelerated. They drove for less than a minute before it turned right and accelerated more. The speed rose, and she realized they were getting on the interstate. The transmission growled in her ear, the floor growing warm beneath her. What felt like a shoe came down on her midriff and stayed, not pressing too hard, just firm enough to hold her still. With the van in motion, she wouldn't be able to achieve anything by fighting them anyway. Her next chance to fight would be when they tried to unload her from the van. She hadn't seen how many people were inside the vehicle. Clearly, someone was driving, and two people were in the seat next to her. The thick bag muffled things too much for her to tell any real difference in voices, but she thought there were three men and one woman. The van drove for what felt like a long time. Her pulse had slowed, though every time she thought more about planning for escape, it jumped again. When the van finally turned silently right and reduced speed, she knew they were leaving the interstate. How far they'd gone, she didn't know, but she felt they couldn't be too far outside the city. They turned right, accelerated slightly. A horn honked nearby, a loud car stereo pumped out bass for a moment before passing them or being passed. A loud motorcycle went by. They drove for several minutes before a right turn took them onto a road that felt different, rutted, gravel crunched under the tires. Lacey tried to hold her head up to keep it from bouncing off the hard floor so much. The foot stayed rooted to her stomach, keeping her roughly in place. She reached her bound hands out to try and grab something for stability, but when they fell on a jeans-clad leg, she jerked them back against her chest. They'd be arriving somewhere soon, she was sure. If they were in Monument or Black Forest on a dirt road, they'd be reaching houses, and there wouldn't be a bunch of through streets. The temperature in the van had cooled considerably, and she realized someone must have rolled down a window. The van slowed to a creep, braking them, slightly accelerating. Perhaps they were trying to find a specific street or house number. When the van turned once more, almost rolling her out from under the foot, she braced her head between her arms and held it up. This road or driveway was way bumpier than even the dirt and gravel road had been. Suspecting they were almost at their destination, Lacey tensed her body, ready to fight if the opportunity came. She couldn't run with her legs bound, but she could scream. There was no property around here that she was familiar with that would be so isolated no one would be able to hear her. Both Black Forest and Monument were heavily populated, despite being treed properties outside the city. She'd always questioned if people really had more privacy out here to justify the price of the homes, or if it was just the illusion of privacy that appealed to them. The van crunched to a stop. Relief from the cessation of jolts and bumps coursed through her, followed immediately by a flood of adrenaline. The sounds of people releasing seatbelts, moving on the seats, gathering items, and opening doors vibrated around her. Cold air flowed in from outside, bitter and biting. She strained to hear their words, to track the people around her. The foot lifted. She waited. Then hands were on her ankles, pulling her across the floor of the van. Another set grabbed her upper arms. She bucked against them, pulling her legs in, then kicking them out. She screamed as loud as she could, all sound and fury. She babbled, screamed, "Help!" Another set of hands took her, wrapping around her waist, squeezing tight. Her scream cut off. When she tried again, she could only grunt against the pressure on her lungs. "No one can hear you scream, chickie," said a rough male voice. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A series of vibrations tickled along her side. They hadn't taken her phone from her. She willed them not to hear it, grunted out as much sound as she could to cover it up. Other vehicles crunched over the gravel, several though she couldn't tell how many. Voices were all around her now, conversations, greetings. Footsteps sounded over varying types of ground. A spray of cold moisture hit her, snow perhaps blowing over her skin. Then she was inside a building, warmth flowing through her, heating her body. It quickly grew too hot for her coat. It felt subtropical. Sweat broke out on her upper lip and back. It sounded like a party. The voices boisterous, silverware clacking on dishes, laughter. The man at her waist spoke to someone. "We've got the dog. Did they already bring the goat?" A deep male voice answered, "It's already outside. Head on back." They were on the move again. This time they left the heat and went back out into the cold. Then heat embraced her again, competing with the cold. The sound of a fire snapping and crackling filled the air. Her captors lowered her onto the cold, hard ground. Someone removed her mask and she blinked up at the faces looking down at her. A bonfire danced a few feet away, people in all white clothing milling about it, glasses in hand. A man knelt beside her and unwrapped the tape from her ankles. He left the wrist bindings. "What am I doing here?" she asked. "Why did you take me?" "Those questions will be answered soon. For now, enjoy the revelry." He stood up and walked away. The others did the same. Lacey sat up and looked around. Another woman with bound hands sat beside the fire, staring into it. She was lovely, with red hair and dark eyes. She was the only other person Lacey could see who wasn't wearing white. Lacey stood and stomped off the ice snow crystals that clung to her clothes. The warmth of the fire kept her from being too cold. She approached the other woman, careful and slow, not sure if this might truly be an ally. It seemed strange that these people would kidnap two women only to walk away and leave them amongst the party guests. The woman looked up at her approach, an expression Lacey didn't recognize flickering across her face in an instant. "You must be the dog." Thinking back on what the man had said earlier, Lacey said, "And you the goat?" "That's right. Not terribly flattering, is it?" "Do you know what it means?" "All I know is we're to be sacrificed tonight." A jolt of panic shot through Lacey's stomach. "Why are you just sitting here then? We should run." "And go where? There are people all around us. They've been walking from neighboring houses. As far as I can tell, there's nowhere safe to go. It can't be everyone out here. Do you know where we are?" "No, they blindfolded me." The woman looked back into the fire, dismissing Lacey. Lacey looked at her a moment longer, but it was obvious this woman had no desire to flee with her. She'd have to do it alone. No one stopped her when she walked over to the split rail fence and looked out into the woods. There were scattered footprints in the hard-packed snow. Distant house lights showed bright and comforting in the distance, but not too far. She could make it there if she left when no one was looking. She peered over her shoulder to make sure the partygoers still ignored her, and she pulled her phone from her pocket as discreetly as possible and dialed 911. It rang several times, each second of dead air between the rings, another level of panic. Then a voice, the most amazing sound she thought she'd ever heard. "You've reached 911. What's your emergency?" Lacey whispered, looking behind her again. "I've been kidnapped. Can you trace my phone?" "I'm sorry, ma'am, I can't hear you. Are you able to speak louder?" The phone broke into static. Lacey pulled back and looked at it. Just one bar of signal. Taking a chance that even if someone overheard her, she could be rescued in time, she spoke up. "I've been kidnapped. I'm being held at a house. I think it might be Black Forest or Monument. Can you trace my phone?" We can get your general area, but not your exact location. Are you in immediate danger? I don't know. Okay. Are there any identifying features around you? A rock structure, perhaps an odd house? Lacey brought the phone down to her waist to hide the glare of the screen and looked around once more. This time she took in the house and its surroundings. All she could see were trees and distant lights. The house itself was a normal house. Nothing stood out about it. She brought the phone back up to her ear. Dead air. The call had dropped. Dialing one more time, she willed the dispatcher to answer. Instead, her phone beeped. No signal. She typed out a rapid text to both her mother and her date. Help, kidnapped, tell them to trace my phone. The text returned an error. It hadn't sent. Frustrated, she dropped the phone back into her pocket and turned her back to the fence. The partygoers looked to be almost an equal mix of men and women, with maybe a few more men. There were several men in matching white gowns that looked like togas. Everyone else wore normal-looking outfits, nice clothing that happened to be white. A large bowl stood on an altar of some sort, squares of paper folded inside it. As she watched, a woman walked up and dropped another slip of paper in. No one paid Lacey any mind. They didn't so much as glance in her direction. No time like the present, she whispered to herself. She turned to the fence, braced herself with her bound hands, and threw a leg over. It was easier than she'd expected, and she quickly got the second leg over. When she glanced behind her, she was relieved to find that no one seemed to have noticed. She ran as fast as she had ever run. The snow crunched beneath her feet, sometimes resisting her and causing her to slip. She kept her feet through sheer willpower and ran toward those distant lights, ducking low, hanging branches, and darting around tree trunks and pines. Her bound hands made it harder to keep her balance, but she fought her way forward. Her legs ached at the effort of running across the unruly ground, her feet painfully cold as bits of stale snow drifted into her boots. The lights of the house grew closer. She refused to look back. Surely she heard if they came after her. When she reached the side of the house, she paused to check her phone again. No dice. She raced around to where she thought the front would be. Luck was on her side, and a porch and house number told her she'd gotten it right. She climbed the stairs, careful of her footing on the slick steps. Darkness had come, plunging the front range into cold night temperatures and refreezing melted snow into ice puddles. Light shone through a long rectangular window on either side of the door. She pressed the small round doorbell, hearing it chime inside. A moment later, footsteps approached inside. A lock cranked, and the door opened. A pleasant-looking woman looked out at her, took in her bound hands, and smiled. Hello, dear. Lost? A man walked up behind the woman. He looked clean-cut and professional in a white suit matching his wife, who wore a white silk gown. You're at the wrong house. Are you the goat or the dog? No, yelled Lacey. She turned to run down the stairs, slipping a couple steps down. She managed to grab the railing before she could fall away, wrenching muscles in her back, shoulder, and arm. Holding the railing to stay upright, she continued down the stairs. She looked back. The couple still stood in the doorway, their eerie, vacant smiles fixed in place. Footsteps crunched through the snow, and there stood several of the men from the party. They must have followed her at a distance, not chasing, knowing exactly where a fleeing woman would go. The couple came down the stairs behind her. Lacey looked over the railing to see how far it would be if she jumped over now, but more men stood in the woods, scattered. Anywhere she could run was covered. They had her trapped. She slumped and sat on the steps. If they wanted to take her, they could work for it. The man above her said, I'll grab the car. It'll be easier to take her back in it. His steps disappeared back up and into the house, the front door closing. If he was inside, that meant only the woman stood behind her. A new glimmer of hope coursed through Lacey's body. If she could get into the house, she could run toward the back, maybe find a way out. Sure, they'd chase her, but this meant she had a chance. She stood up and turned to run up the stairs, but the woman blocked her way, a small gun trained down toward Lacey. Sorry, dear, but we can't proceed without you. One of the men came up the stairs and took Lacey by the arm. His hold was firm, and he used it to steer her down the stairs to the garage door, which opened at their approach. An SUV backed out and stopped beside them, and the man opened the back door to shove her in. Another one got in on the other side, and the woman climbed into the passenger seat. The others outside headed back through the woods. As they proceeded up the driveway, Lacey eyeballed the two men on either side of her. They paid her no mind, looking straight ahead. She reached her bound hands forward, tried to get them around the driver's neck, but it was harder to do than she thought. Her arms too tightly bound. All she managed to do was mess up his hair and cause him to swerve briefly. The two men in back with her pulled her back and used their bulk to hold her. After that, the drive was quick, and Lacey once more got marched through the house. This time, she could see where they took her. The house was large and decorated like one would expect from a cabin in the woods, not a large house in a ritzier woodland suburbia. Quiche bear, deer, and moose sculptures stood on tabletops, paintings of forest and wildlife decorating the walls. The furniture was all polished wood with green cushions on the sofas. There was no technology here except for a sound system and speakers. When she looked more closely at the paintings, she noticed bloody goats in several of them. A few even had dogs on the end of spears. Triumphant hunters stood around their prey. Back in the yard, the bonfire bigger than it had been before, the man escorting her pushed her down into the snow. Another man brought over the woman she'd spoken to earlier, the dog. The men in togas came to stand between the fire and the two kneeling women. Another man came up beside them, a sword in his hands. Singing voices sounded from somewhere behind her, and Lacey looked over her shoulder at the women of the party gathered on one side of the altar. They were singing what sounded like a hymn. The men not involved in the ceremony stood to the other side of the altar in an orderly line. The two at the end of the line held ropes attached to the necks of what appeared to be two gray wolves. One of the toga men started talking. As you know, we gathered tonight to celebrate Lupercalia, to purify Colorado and bring an end to the evil that has visited the city of Colorado Springs. Specifically, we help to rid the city council and political offices of the dirty deeds and crimes running so rampant, of the flawed thinking that has descended upon a once great city and the tourists that have brought their evil ways from other states. The women stopped singing. The only sound for a brief moment was the crackling of the fire. Then a chorus of voices intoned, "Purify." To that end, we, the Lupercalia, must sacrifice a goat and a dog, which will bring both purity and fertility. Men, choose your names. The men, one by one, stepped up to the bowl and drew out a piece of paper. When each had taken a slip and the bowl stood empty, the first man walked up to one of the women and held his hand out. Every time, the woman took the proffered hand and followed him to an area of the yard away from everyone else, where they removed their clothing and stood waiting for something. They all did this until each man had been paired off with a woman. Then they faced the fire from their respective positions. The two men with the leashed wolves tied the wolves up to posts already in position and left them there. Very good, intoned the man she'd come to think of as the priest. Let us move on to the next step. The man who kept control of the redhead pulled her to her feet and walked with her toward the second Lupercalia in the line. He had her kneel at the other man's feet. The man with the sword handed it to the second Lupercalia, then jogged over to grab a tree stump that stood a couple feet away. This he placed in front of the woman. The man controlling her pushed her head onto the stump and moved her hair to the side so her neck was bared. He then pulled a knife out and sliced her shirt down the back, pushing it down until her back lay bare. The woman's body moved in jerks, sobs escaping her. Run, do something, Lacey yelled. She slammed her shoulder into the man beside her, knocking him down. Then she ran toward the house, determined to get inside so she could lock them out, find a phone that worked or a set of car keys. This time, no one ignored her escape attempt. Couples darted toward her, a terrifying crowd of naked men and women. Lacey put her head down, figuring she could bowl her way through them if it came to that. She shoved her hands out in front of her and used them as a battering ram through the nearest couple. Again and again, she knocked people out of her way. The door was only feet away. She ran toward it. Someone tackled her from the side and she went down. She struggled, kicking and hitting at anyone she could reach. Her foot hit one woman and sent her flying backward. She cracked a man's nose, sending an instantaneous sheet of blood down the front of his white sweater. Each hit felt like a small victory. They pinned her down, multiple bodies atop her own. Their fleshy weight pressed upon her made it hard to breathe. She panted and arched her back, tried to kick out again. They held every part of her down. From across the yard, a metallic rasp sounded, followed by something heavy falling. People started moving away from Lacey, and two men grasped her up her arms and pulled her to her feet. She jerked her arm out of the hold of one of the men, but he punched her in the face. Her head snapped back, pain exploding through her cheek and eye socket. He took her arm again and led her forward. When she could see clearly again, Lacey looked toward the Lupercalia. What she saw froze her in place. The woman's headless body lay on the ground, naked back up. The priest held the sword up, running a finger through the blood. This he put on two of the other men's foreheads. Handing the sword off, the priest then took up a bowl. From it, he drew a cloth, which he squeezed, liquid tumbling back into the bowl. He washed the blood from the foreheads of both men before throwing the cloth into the fire. The two men laughed, arms held out, heads leaning back. The laughter was loud and large, crazed. This part of the ceremony done, the final Lupercalia used a knife to finish cutting the woman's clothing off. He rolled her to the side to cut the tape around her hands and pulled the last of her shirt off before adjusting her face down once more. Then he cut into her back, pulling strips of her skin off and laying them neatly on the ground beside her. He cut until patches of skin were removed from her back, buttocks, arms, and legs. Then he picked the body up, flipped it over, and cut swaths out of her stomach and thighs. Once she'd been stripped of most of her skin, he picked her up and tossed her into the bonfire. Sparks shot out and the fire dimmed briefly before roaring back into the sky with its new fuel. Lacey fought again, but she couldn't free herself. The men dragged her forward to where the stump sat, thick blood covering the top. The man who'd previously held the sword picked up the head by the red hair and walked back to the altar to place the head atop it next to the bowl. Come collect your whips, men, the priest said. The men left their partners long enough to gather the strips. These they hit the women with, many of whom playfully exposed their backsides. Giggling ensued, ridiculous in the face of Lacey's fear and the woman's death. It all felt so surreal. "Let the fertility rite begin," yelled the priest. The men surrounding her forced Lacey's head down, and one man held her in place, his hand flat at the back of her skull. Hands held her arms. A knife sliced through her coat and shirt, loosening them. Cold air needled her back and edged around her sides. The blood in the stump had already turned cold and sticky against her chin. From around the yard came the sounds of breathy cries of ecstasy, flesh slapping, flesh grunts. A fucking orgy. Lacey was going to die in an orgy full of wealthy people who didn't like the politics of the city. Feet crunched into Lacey's line of sight. She felt her hair swept back from her neck. The hem of the man's toga lifted slightly. With a whistle, the sword came down toward her head. Lacey used all her strength to roll sideways just as the hand was lifted from her head. The sword slammed into the stump and stuck there. She stood up and barreled forward, knocking the priest into the fire where he screamed and fought to get out. Others ran to him to help, and he pulled one in with him, his screams joining with the priest's. Lacey turned her back to the fire, daring them to come at her. She would rather burn than let them finish their ceremony. A weird sex cult did not get to be the end of her. The men around her kept their distance, unsure of what to do now that their leader had stopped screaming. They shot each other looks as if waiting for someone else to make the first move. The heat behind Lacey increased, licking along her bare back. The men drew back. The couples scattered about the yard, naked and entangled in each other's limbs, stopped and stared. The wolves whined and jerked at their leashes. Something wasn't right. Lacey looked behind her. From the flames rose a large figure with goat horns. He grew upward, not out of the flames, but part of them. Lacey tried to run, but hands of flames grabbed her and lifted her into the air, searing her skin. She could smell the sickening, sweet odor of her own flesh burning, hear it sizzling. The pain washed white hot throughout her entire body. She screamed, putting all her fear and agony behind it. Then her world was nothing but flames, red and orange, then white, until her eyes melted and ran down her face. The pain ceased, her nerves burned completely away. Before her eardrums burst, she heard the sounds of animal running once more. And that's it. That was Blind Date from Happy Ghoulidays. You can find this and other collections at thewarriormuse.com, and they're available wherever you can get ebooks. Amazon carries the paperback. Oh, and I have a podcast if you want to listen to that at www.mysteries, monsters, and mayhem. So you can check that out. It's all about true crime and ghosts and cryptids and all that good stuff. And you can find it anywhere that you can find podcasts, really. Spotify, all of those sites have it. Thank you.